and that is um, looking not only at the Gospel of John, but I kind of said we'd be doing kind of a two-pronged thing. We'd be learning about the Gospel of John, but along the way, what I want to do is help us discover how to read the Bible, to kind of put some tools in our toolbox that will allow us to be good students of the Scriptures. And so we spent a little time last week, and maybe just Matt's here; he can advance the slide for us tonight. But by way of review, we looked last week at the big picture. How do you look at the theme of a whole book? And I said to you last time that if we really want to study God's Word well, one of the places we have to start is by learning to identify the theme of a whole book. Right? You best understand what a particular passage is about when you get a sense of what the intention of the author in a book was really trying to communicate, right? Because John had a different purpose in writing than Matthew did, and then Luke and Mark, and all the texts of the Old Testament, same thing. There were all different purposes behind that. So I said, if you really want to understand the message of a book or of a passage, start by trying to identify the message of a particular book of the Bible. I'll use the analogy, and we can flip the slide here, Matt. I'll use the analogy. I've used this before. Think about a soundtrack to a movie. If you watch a movie, you know that there's often a soundtrack that's kind of woven through the whole movie. If you think of Star Wars, it's through the whole series, right? I'm not going to try to hum the Imperial March theme to you, but if you've seen Star Wars, you know that there's music, and it shows up every time. And that music has a way of tying together the whole movie or the whole series of movies. And biblical books are actually a lot like that in the sense that there's a common idea that's woven through. And when you find that, that actually shines light on what the meaning of a particular text is. We talked a little bit last week about, if you need to identify the theme, how do you do that? And we talked about a few different ideas, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time going over those all again, but I'll just kind of remind you, especially some of you weren't here last week. Sometimes the author just comes right out and tells us what his purpose is, and that's the case in John. John actually just comes out and says, these things are written so that you may know that Jesus is the Messiah, that you might believe in him, and that you might have life in his name. So John makes it easy for us. Luke makes it easy for us as well. Matthew and Mark, it's a little harder, but there are some other things you can do. If you read through the whole book, you'll start to hear some repeated words, some of the same words that come out again and again. And I would suggest, for those of you that lead Bible studies from time to time, if you're going to be focusing on a book, sit down and read the whole book front to back. It might take you a couple hours if it's a long book, but then start paying attention what words come up over and over again, and that's a key place to look for what the author is trying to get at. You don't have to pay attention to words like the or a or an, but bigger words like witness or light or life, as in John's gospel, testimony, signs, those kinds of things. Sometimes knowing the historical setting, knowing who the author is, knowing who the audience is. This is especially true when you read the New Testament letters, the epistles. What's going on in a particular church? Why did Paul need to write to the Thessalonians at that time? What was he concerned about? Those kinds of things will help you identify the theme of the book. And then, as I said, reading or hearing the book aloud. If you can, read the book a couple times if it's a shorter one. That'll start to get you familiar with the big picture theme. We kind of put together, we didn't actually come right out and state it, but a rough, I think if you're looking at the Gospel of John and you want a rough idea, here's what I think it would look like. Again, this is largely based on what John tells us. John testifies to us that Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus, the Son of God, is the Messiah who gives life to those who believe in him. That idea you're going to find tying the whole gospel together, and as you go then to each individual passage, you're going to start to see and interpret the passage in light of that theme. And we did a couple of exercises last week looking at when we know that theme, then the story of the woman at the well, for example, takes on even deeper meaning because we see that this Samaritan woman is testifying to Jesus, right? So that was just one example. This evening, I want to look at learning to listen to the text itself. So you've identified the theme of a book. Now you have to look at a passage in front of you. Maybe you're just doing this for your personal devotions. Maybe you're going to be leading a Bible study group. Maybe you just want to study a little more deeply in your own personal, for your own personal benefit. You've got a text in front of you. Now how do you hear that text and listen to what it means? And I want to just get into a little bit, why does this matter? So next slide up. Why is it important to hear the message of the text as the original author intended it, right? Why does that actually matter? And I put up a few examples here. These are some of my favorites that can illustrate the ways that when you just pull a text out of the context and you pull it out of the book as a whole and you just hold on to a single verse, you run the risk of twisting around the meaning of that verse. We were at Dollywood a couple weeks ago, which is an amusement park there in Tennessee, and we were in line for one of the roller coasters, and the roller coaster was like an eagle, so it looked like an eagle. Then you hang there underneath, so there's nothing beneath your feet. And as we're getting in line, there was a picture of the eagle, and underneath it was a Bible verse. They shall mount up on wings like eagles. And I thought, wow, they found a proof text for a roller coaster. I'm not sure that's what the prophet Isaiah had in mind when he wrote those words, nevertheless. But here are a couple of examples. I hear these much more often, especially around this time of year, that first one. Graduates, there's no recent high school graduates here, but high school graduates always get a card, and it will quote Jeremiah 29, verse 11. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to give you hope and a future, to prosper you and not to harm you. It's a wonderful verse. And I'm not even saying it couldn't apply to a high school graduate. But I am saying if you look at the bigger context, Jeremiah is speaking those words to people who are about to face 70 very long and difficult years of adversity while they were in exile. And so God is coming along to them and he's saying, listen, I know the plans I have for you, and I'm going to prosper you because you're my people, but it's not going to be easy. Now, I'm not sure that's what you have in mind when you give it to a high school student, right? You kind of think, hey, college is going to be great, you're going to get a career and married, and life is going to be good. But it's more nuanced than that, right? So once you understand the proper meaning, I think maybe you might use the text a little bit differently. Here's another one. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Another wonderful text. And it can be used in a lot of very good ways, but it can also be used to say, you know what? Whatever you want to do, you can do. And maybe in the most extreme case, right, you get a scrawny high school kid like me who wanted to play basketball. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And the answer to that is, well, I suppose Christ could have given me supernatural size and strength, but he didn't. And so, doesn't really apply there. Really what Paul was saying when he wrote that was, I know how to live in poverty, I know how to live in riches, I know how to live when life is going well and when it's not going well. I can face all of these things because what matters is not my external circumstances, it's what Christ is giving me. Now again, I'm not saying you can't use those words to encourage someone, you certainly can, but just understand what Paul was really after. What was Paul really saying? When you listen carefully to the meaning of the text in its proper context, it comes across a little differently. And then last example here, Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Now, where do we hear this today? Who's heard this sort of broadly, right? You all have. And when do you hear? What is the context in which you hear that verse? When they're doing something wrong so someone's doing something wrong and you're coming up to them and you're saying, hey, what you're doing is not right. And what do they say? Hey, judge not. Don't judge me. Now, is that what Jesus meant when he said that? Did he say we don't have to hold each other accountable? Did he say that we're free to live however we want and no one can tell you otherwise? Is that what he meant? The answer there is no, right? Not at all. What he was really getting at, and you know this because if you look just a little further down in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus actually says, for the same way that it's measured out to you, it will be measured back to you. Or the same way you measure it out, it will be measured back to you. He's really saying you need to judge yourself in light of the gospel and then using that same humility and that framework, then you speak to others. We know there are other places in Matthew 18 where Jesus talks about going to a brother or a sister who's caught up in sin, and he says, here's how you're to address it. He doesn't say, well, don't judge. He doesn't. That's not what the text means. So anytime you read a text, you have to make sure you're not imposing your own meaning on it. You have to learn to look at what did the original author mean to communicate? What was he trying to say? And that requires listening to the text, right? Listening, becoming a good listener to the text as a whole. Let's go to the next slide here, because then the question is, okay, so how do we listen well to a particular text? And I actually want to spend a couple weeks doing this. I want to kind of break it into two parts, really. The first is bone and marrow, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then next week, we're going to actually meet. We might even meet next door and kind of sit around tables so you can have a paper in front of you and do what I'll show you a couple things to do. But the first thing is the structure of a text. When you come to a text, you have to learn to identify the actual structure of the passage. The biblical writers never wrote down stuff haphazardly and random and kind of threw a bunch of stuff together and hoped that it all made sense. Sometimes it feels a little like that, especially when you get to some of the letters of Paul near the end. It seems like he's just throwing everything but the kitchen sink there. But even there's a structure. And this is especially true when you get to narratives, like stories, when you get to teaching sections, when you get to the Gospels. There's a structure for every book, and then kind of underneath that, every passage is carefully structured and arranged. And as we can identify that structure, we'll better understand the meaning. Does that make sense? Any questions or comments on that so far? All right, so then, was someone going to say something? Yeah, John, go ahead. Exactly. And the more we understand, so John is asking if, as we read the Bible, do we understand more what the context is? And I think the answer to that is yes. And the more we understand the context, then the more we understand the meaning of the text, right? So context is everything. You pull the text out of a context, and you can make it say whatever you want. But as you begin to pay attention to context, you begin to understand more and more what the author meant. And then structure as well, right? Structure is just how a text is arranged grammatically and structurally to make the point. So what are some things that you think you need to do if you want to understand? If you want to try to figure out the structure of a passage, what are some things that you'd need to look for and identify? Anyone, just go ahead and raise your hand or shout it out. Yes, definitely. Definitely. It's exactly. That's how you get to putting a Bible verse on a roller coaster sign, right? Because you just pull a verse out, but you need to look at the bigger context or the bigger selection, more verses than one. Yeah, what else? The adverbs. Yeah. Yes. Therefore is, yep, all those words, transitional words like therefore or so then are like they ought to jump off the page at you because they indicate the author is about to make that move from one section now to another. So Romans 12 verse 1, therefore, in view of God's mercy, all of chapters 1 through 11, now I want you to offer yourself as living sacrifices, right? It's a key transition. Mark's gospel is full of a lot of and, then, right? He's always moving. What else? What other things might clue you into the structure of a particular text? Sometimes it depends on the kind of literature that you're reading, right? A story is going to read differently than a parable or a teaching section or an epistle. What are some things you look for in a story? If you're reading a portion of Scripture that's narrative? What are some things that are important that will tell you to kind of that'll mark out the structure? Don't make it harder than it is. I just worry you're overthinking it. It's. Mhm. Mhm. You're talking about Lazarus and the rich man, right? Yeah. Mhm. Well, you're raising it. Yeah. That's a good question, right? And those are sometimes the issues that, like, if you're doing a Bible study on that text, there's where commentaries can kind of help you see. We might call it behind the scenes, right? Because there's some scholarly discussion. That's the only parable where Jesus actually gives a name to a person, rather than just say, a certain man was going down from Jerusalem. He says, no, this guy's name was Lazarus, which leads many to conclude, well, that was actually a factual event. And then there are others that say, well, no, Jesus was really just telling a story. Um, Honestly, I'm not sure where I come down on that. I tend to think more parable, but I see the case for factual story. But mhm, that's right. And those are the things that, again, you have to have your mind tuned in on. And a good study Bible always can just alert you to those things. That has good series of notes. And Debbie, I saw your hand up, and then Margie as well. Hmm. Right. Yep. Right. Right. So you have to know, and this is where Paul's bringing it up. You have to know: is this an actual recounting of a series of events, or was it a parable? Because if we can call them, the rules of interpreting are going to be just a little different depending on what it is. Um, Margie, what were you going to say? Hmm. Right. Good. Hmm. Right. And I'm even gonna come back to that a little more next week, because when you read the same event in multiple gospels, you'll sometimes notice that one gospel writer, I'm not going to use the word changes, but highlights different aspects of the story. And they don't do that by accident. They do that because they're trying to emphasize something. And it's not that one gospel contradicts the other. It's just that, Matthew wants us to focus on this part of the story, and maybe Luke says, yeah, that's true, but look at this. And they're both trying to, that gets back to the theme of the whole book. You can see why the bigger theme and message that they're trying to communicate. That's very important. What else? What other things might clue you into the structure of a story? John and then Jerry. Hmm. Right. You all have two eyes here, right? And two hands. Hmm. Right. So learning to interpret metaphors and figures of speech versus concrete literal statements or commands, right? So sometimes you hear it say, well, I take the Bible literally. And then you just have to check, do you have two eyes and you have two hands? And then if so, they don't take it literally, and they shouldn't, right? That wasn't meant to be taken literally, but you have to pay attention to what was Jesus trying to communicate? And we're going to revisit that a little more next week as well. Jerry, you had something as well. Yep. That's that's another big one. That's true for the whole book if you're trying to understand the meaning of a whole book, or if you're trying to pay attention to a specific passage. Anytime the word is repeated more than twice is something you should just look for and pay attention to that. Anything else? Any other things? If you're going to look at a story, what are some things to pay attention to? How many of you have ever watched a movie where it seems like there's no real conflict or problem? about the most boring movie you can watch, right? If there's never a problem, well then what's going to happen, right? There's nothing to go on. And that's true always in biblical stories. You'll notice that stories kind of, I should maybe put it up there, but I didn't. But stories always follow a format where you sort of get a couple of introductory setting kinds of things, and then you get a moment where there's a problem that comes up, and it might be a conflict between people. It might be like in the feeding of the 5,000. They're hungry all of a sudden, and they've been away for a couple of days, and there's no one to feed them. The problem has been introduced, and then it's kind of like you picture a mountain peak. You get the problem gets worse and worse, and then you're left wondering how is this gonna get solved? And then at that point, kind of the climax of the story, then someone steps in. Usually, in most cases, it's God that intervenes, and he, or Jesus in the case of the feeding of the 5,000. Then Jesus says, just distribute the loaves, and then the problem has been fixed, and then so things kind of come back down the mountain, as it were. They come back down, and then you get the outcome. And then a lot of times there's an interpretation of what that was meant to teach, more than just, oh, hey, there's a problem, there's no food, now we have food. But there's actually an interpretation of that as well. But you can always look, especially if you're reading narrative, and I don't remember what percentage, but a good large percentage of the Bible is narrative, Old Testament, New Testament. And anytime you read a story, pay attention. What is the problem? How does that problem escalate? Where is that moment when the problem is finally solved? And then what is the outcome? Sometimes you'll see it like a little double mountain peak. The problem goes up, it's solved, and then just when you think it's fixed, there's another complication, and then it gets up again, and then it's solved once and for all. But if you pay attention to that, it can really clue you into what the text is trying to communicate. And again, you often see God is the one stepping in and solving the problem. Not always, because sometimes the problems are more about rebellion, and it's a human solution, and then kind of creates more of a mess. But pay attention to the conflict. Let's look at an example. If you would open your Bibles, and I want you to look at John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And in a minute, I'm going to have one of you read that. But this is what I want you to pay attention to. I want you. We looked at the story a little bit last week. It's a story of the wedding at Cana. And we said last week, again, we were looking at the big picture. John is trying to testify. He's giving his expert testimony that Jesus is the Messiah, and he's calling for faith in him. So we know that his stories and his accounts are all going to somehow fall under that theme. But now we're zeroing in on one text. And I want us really just to look at the structure of this text. And I want you to pay attention to the questions. What's the conflict? What's the climax of the story? How's the conflict resolved? What's the outcome? And then how does John apply that story? So just kind of tuck those questions in the back of your mind, and then we'll read it, and then we'll spend a couple minutes kind of trying to unpack that. Who has it in front of them and has a good loud voice they'd like to read John 2, 1 to 11? Okay, John, why don't you read it, and just make sure to read it in a good loud voice for us. Okay, so what's the conflict in this story? What's the problem that John is showing us as he recounts this event? Again, no more wine, right? That's comes right at the beginning. There's no more wine, and if you're at a wedding, that's a big problem. It must have been a Baptist wedding. No comments. um, so how does the conflict intensify? How does John sort of develop the problem and show that this is really a very serious concern, a serious problem? Hmm. Right. Jesus even seems resistant to get involved. Now we're going to come back to that next week. I don't know about you, but every time I read that, I think, what is going on here with Jesus and his mother? Right? Why does he not just right away say, "Sure, I can help"? And then the next question is, and why does he then jump right in and help if he just said he wouldn't help? Right? So we're going to leave that little problem aside for now because that, I don't know, again, it always puzzles me. Even though I've kind of figured out the answer, it still always jumps off the page at me. We'll come back to that more next week. But the point is, the conflict seems to be getting more intense because the wine has run out. Jesus doesn't seem to want to help right away. Then he gets busy. Where is the conflict decided, if you will? Where does the problem worked out? Well, I would say it's before that. So the problem is there's no wine at the wedding feast. So where is that problem resolved? He deals with it. Right. So in verses 8 through 9, Jesus gives the instructions there, you'll notice, and he uses those ceremonial jars. We're going to come back to those as well, because those are important also, because John goes out of his way to tell us some detail about them. And then I would say at it's the second part of verse 9 there, the water, it's almost nonchalant. The water had been turned into wine. He doesn't say poof, magic and there was lightning and, symbols or something. It was just, oh, and the water turned into wine, right? It's almost, but the point is the problem has been solved for right now. And then the outcome is verses, second part of 9 and then into 10, where, the host of the wedding feast is really relieved because problem solved. But then what does John do? And this is, I think, what Paul, you were getting at earlier. When John concludes this, how does John interpret this story and kind of apply it to us? What does he say at the end? Hmm. Right. Now you're talking back at the beginning of John in John 1, right? And now he's coming back to that theme exactly. So there's where again you're piecing together, and this is exactly the right thing we need to be doing. You're piecing together this story in light of the whole Gospel of John, because these aren't just a bunch of isolated little entries from John's diary. John's making a point. He's already said in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and he's making the point that Jesus is God, and Jesus is revealing His glory. Now John tells us that Jesus comes to reveal his glory, and the first way he does it is at this wedding feast, right? And he does it by providing the best wine that anyone's ever had at a wedding feast, right? Anything else? So anything else that John interprets or applies this story? Yes, yes, it is. Why do you see that important? Yes. Yes, yes, exactly. And next week, I'll give you a little foretaste. Next week, we're going to tie that into the stone jars, the 6 stone jars that were there that hold 20 to 30 gallons. These are things that are not so much related to structure, but they are absolutely key to understanding this story. So what we've done tonight is we've put together the narrative structure. You have a problem, you have some uncertainty. How's this going to work out? Then Jesus steps in and provides the best wine that anyone has ever had. And then John says, and this was the first sign. This was the pointer to the glory of Jesus Christ. Now, we've only kind of scratched the surface here. We're going to go next week. What we're going to do is we're going to